Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to the 5th annual Edelman Smithfield Investor Summit. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and thank you also to LSEG for kindly hosting us. My name's Andy Wild. I'm Edelman Smithfield's Managing Director here in London. I also head our financial services team globally, and we're very lucky in that capacity that we work with some of the top investment firms in the world. And I realize that some people in the auditorium have attended this event in previous years, so forgive me. But for those that haven't joined us previously, what this event is all about is bringing together the chief executives, the CIOs, the senior investors from those top investment firms and hearing what they've got to say about how next year and the years after that will pan out. And so across the panels today, you'll hear people talking about geopolitics. We'll talk about debt piles, the opportunities and threats of AI, US exceptionalism or not, as the case may be. I think Anthony Scaramucci later on will even probably try to convert some of you onto the merits of crypto, unless, of course, you've read his book, which is in your bags, and you may be there already by the time we reach that point in the day. Everything's on the record. And I mention that because we're delighted that so many members of the press are here with us today. And just a couple of perfunctory notices before we get going. Bathrooms out there, sort of go as far as you can, then turn right. And then after each panel, there'll be a roving mic. So just kind of wave your hand in the air and a mic will materialize. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to speak to Lord Kim Darroch. And alongside serving as British permanent representative to the EU and also the National Security Advisor, Lord Darroch's probably best known for his time as ambassador to the US during Donald Trump's first term in office. Obviously, 1 year on from Donald Trump becoming president for the second time, there are very few more qualified than Lord Darroch to give an insight into what we might expect next year. And I'm sure that this will be a recurrent theme throughout the morning. So while I move from this stern podium to the more chillaxed environment of the seating area, please help me welcome Lord Darroch to the stage. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
So I think we'll start off, if we may, with a couple of quotes from your book.
Right.
And
Still available on Amazon, by the way.
it's a very good book. But in it, you use the word inept and insecure to describe the first Trump administration. And you describe it kind of in the terms of a medieval court. Is it different this time around?
First of all, I mean, I would stand by that description of the first term. The thing about Trump's first term was he had never run for any public office anywhere, not even local council, nothing like that. And so he leapt from being a pure businessman to the most powerful office on the planet. And he didn't know many people, so he mostly assembled a cabinet and a White House made of people recommended to him by the Republican Party. And he didn't know how government worked at all, really. He'd been, I mean, people talk about him as a businessman, which he is, but it was mostly property development. So he wasn't a man who was dabbling in the markets much or this kind of thing. And he didn't know how to do it. And I think the first 2 years of his first term, he was learning how to make government work, and he was making a lot of mistakes. And I won't go into all the details of things that went wrong, but an awful lot of things in his first term, starting with about a week after he took office. He basically suspended entry into the US for anyone coming from 7 mainly Muslim countries, which you might remember turned the whole airline network into chaos for several days. And it was a piece of legislation that hadn't been through the government system because he didn't trust them at all. So it was literally put together with a couple of commercial lawyers over the weekend by a couple of his staffers. So no wonder it didn't make any sense and it got rejected by the Supreme Court. And, so he was insecure and he made a lot of mistakes in his first term. Yes, the second term is different. First of all, second term, and this is in a way extraordinary considering how much water had been under the bridge, how many things had happened to him. He won bigger in 2024 than in 2016. Doesn't mean he won every state or every demographic, but he did better in every demographic in every state than in 2016. And understandably, he finds that very validating, not least the fact that he lost the popular vote in 2016 by 3 million votes to Hillary Clinton, but he won it in 2024 by 2 million votes. So big turnaround for him. Second, he had a team with him that he's assembled over the last few years who are loyalists and enablers and amplifiers. Third, the Republican Party has become effectively the Donald Trump Party in all but name. There's a Supreme Court that leans heavily rightwards. So he basically has become master of all he surveys. So yes, the second term feels very different. The other thing about the second term is he's looking for his place in the history books. I think in his heart of hearts he knows there's not going to be a third term. So this is what will define his legacy, what the historians write about him. And he's had a series of beliefs, which we can go into, and views that he's held for decades and decades, and he's going to put them into practice. So what you're seeing is Trump unleashed, without guardrails, really going for it. And if you're a fan, that's tremendously exciting. If you're not, it's probably rather terrifying. But this is full bore Trump.
Yeah, and I'm interested, as I'm sure many people here are as well. I mean, your view, sort of as a diplomat dealing with Trump unleashed, as you call it. As an observer of the UK and the way in Europe, sort of dealing with Donald Trump, there's our sort of diplomatic approach, for want of a better word, sort of involves quite a lot of fawning. And I think particularly we've seen it with Ukraine, that in the 28-point plan, there's been a huge amount of kind of careful wording and a real desire not to criticise the original draft and that kind of thing. Do you think that this approach kind of works? Because there seems to be umpteen instances of warm words exchanged, and then warm words probably reciprocally given, but it doesn't seem to do much to actually affect the policy. Yeah. So are we being a bit soft, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
Yeah. I think there's two parts to the answer to that question. First, this guy isn't really a strategist. People ask, is there a plan with Donald Trump? And what he has is a series of deeply embedded beliefs. I mean, he thinks America has done terrible trade deals. He thinks America's friends and allies have taken advantage for decades to build up big trade surpluses while America pays for their defense. He's not a believer in America as the world's policeman. He's not a strong believer in alliances. I mean, America first actually means America alone in a lot of instances. He doesn't think that America should get involved in overseas adventures like Iraq and Afghanistan. And these were beliefs he's held for 40, 50 years. I could show you things he wrote or said back in the 80s, which pretty much could have been part of his 2024 campaign speeches. So, and he was also, he's a businessman through and through. He finds it much easier than most politicians to take decisions. I mean, when I was in number 10, working for a couple of prime ministers and worked for foreign secretaries, and politicians tend to, when faced with options that are really not very attractive, they tend to ask for more analysis and put the decision off as long as possible. Donald Trump isn't like that. He takes decisions very easily and very quickly, often, dare I say, on a fairly limited understanding of the detail and the substance. And he doesn't lie awake at night second-guessing things. But the other side of that is he'll change his mind in an instant if he thinks the facts have changed. Like he instituted on the 4th of April the Liberation Day tariffs on 70-odd countries. 5 days later, Scott Bessent said there was turmoil in the bond market, and he just suspended them all overnight. and move to a different strategy of doing trade deals with people. So he can change his mind very quickly, which is why I've described him as almost like a medieval king, because it can be so capricious and so unpredictable. But there is, underneath it all, there is a sort of, if not a plan, there are beliefs. Now, the other thing you notice about the second term is everyone internationally has learnt the lessons of the first term, which is if you want to do business with, avoid the worst of Donald Trump, then you have to suck up to him and flatter him endlessly. And it's just the reality, I'm afraid. And it's not just Keir Starmer who has had to do it. You'll see there was a NATO summit a couple of months ago where basically the entire membership of NATO had a meeting where, rather than discussing the state of the world, Ukraine, all this stuff, they basically all made a little speech, every leader made a speech, saying how wonderful Donald Trump was and how great it was that he had forced NATO to spend a lot more on defence. If you want an even more recent and a classic example, look at the leak, if you can be bothered, of Steve Witkoff, his international negotiators, conversation with the Russian diplomatic advisor to Vladimir Putin, a guy called Yuri Ushakov, who, when I was national security advisor, I used to go and see. He's been around forever. And this leaked transcript of the telephone call shows Witkoff saying to Ushakov, when Putin next speaks to Trump, could he spend the first 5 minutes congratulating Trump on this and this and this, saying what a great job he's doing and how welcome it is that Trump is trying to build world peace. Now, when your diplomatic negotiator is telling you to tell the president of Russia, first of all, you've got to flatter him. You think there's a trend going around here, stuff is going on. And the truth is that at least for Keir Starmer, it has worked to an extent, because we got with only 10% tariffs and half the level of tariffs on steel of some other countries. It looks like one of the best deals, if not the best deal, around. But the flip side of that, of course, is it's still tariffs.
Yeah.
And we are still worse off than the day before Donald Trump became president, and that's still going to damage our economy. And as with Trump's sort of capricious, unpredictable nature, you could get new tariffs or higher tariffs tomorrow if that's what he decides he needs. So we are on a tightrope for the next 3 years. But, yes, flattery works, I'm afraid. And his officials know it works, and that's why if they're trying to get a deal done, they make sure your leader flatters him, which is extraordinary, but that's just the way it is.
And just on the idea of kind of you mentioned it as the president as a kind of a deal maker, and the necessity of negotiating and potentially renegotiating the trade deals that have been struck. I am just a thought. Do you think that the way to the actual personnel that need to deal with the US, if you were Keir Starmer, would you be thinking that we should enter these trade negotiations in the same way that we have historically, perhaps with professional politicians, Whitehall mandarins, or do you think there's more of a role for the business community to play an active role? I mean, I noticed that obviously the ambassador to the UK from the US is a banker, was a deal maker. So should we be having kind of professional deal makers rather than professional politicians?
It's a really interesting question, and obviously I spent 43 years as a diplomat, so I would say, well, of course diplomats do this stuff. Look, there is no question but that Donald Trump trusts his business mates as negotiators much more than he trusts the official American government machine. And again, to give you one example, Steve Witkoff is his all-purpose negotiator at the moment, a golfing mate, fellow real estate guy of Trump's, and Trump trusts him because he worked with Trump to close some deals. So Witkoff is a great deal closer. Now, is that a good choice? Well, on the plus, I think the jury's still out. On the plus side, Witkoff did negotiate that deal to get the ceasefire in Gaza, which was a considerable achievement, and he did most of the groundwork, although Donald Trump himself, I mean, you have to give credit to Trump for this, he sealed the deal by basically getting quite heavy with Netanyahu and telling Netanyahu there had to be a ceasefire. And Trump was furious about the Israeli attack on Qatar, and that was what prompted him to get hard on this. But Witkoff did a lot of the groundwork, so that's one success for Witkoff. On the other hand, if you look at what Witkoff's efforts to do a ceasefire and a peace deal in Ukraine, everything that he comes back with tends to lean heavily towards Putin's version of a deal. And what you find then is that Marco Rubio, who is a much more mainstream Republican, works with Europeans and talks to the Ukrainians and pulls it back. And then, as we saw in the last 24 hours, the latest round, then the Russians reject it because Putin's not going to accept any deal that doesn't give him everything. And on that, Witkoff has looked a bit naive and certainly hasn't managed to shift Putin to making any concessions at all. So, is he a good negotiator? I can believe that he's quite a tough guy in the room. Does he know enough about international politics to do the job? Well, the jury's out, and let's see where it ends up. But should we follow this? Well, the current business advisor in Number 10, whom I know well, was a key member of our team when we negotiated the trade deal. And although basically it's still harmful to us, that trade deal, it's the best deal out there. So we do use businessmen, and there's always a business. I was in Number 10 twice. There's always a business advisor in there who plays a role in negotiations on trade issues and economic issues. And there have in the past been British businessmen, not in Washington necessarily, but in some of our other posts where economic commercial work is a big thing. And yes, that should continue to be the case. It's a good idea to have people with a big business background in posts where we have big economic commercial interests, provided they're prepared also to do the hard yards of, being out on the diplomatic circuit every night, risking their liver with, all that stuff, and all the boring telegrams about, what's going on in the country which they're assigned to, and all that kind of stuff, provided they're prepared to do that and do, kind of 30 staff reports at the end of each year, that sort of stuff, then yes, it's a good idea to have them.
Well, obviously, Lord Mandelson was recently, his liver was spared. In recent memory, and obviously that position, your old position, has not yet been filled. There's been a lot of press speculation about who it might be. Varun Chandra, that you've mentioned, is one of the names. For a while, I think Sir Mark Sedwell's name was sort of in the mix, and I read this week that Nigel Casey, the US envoy to Moscow, has sort of entered it in the 11th hour. Yeah. I think George Osborne's name was in there at one point. Do you have a favourite? Who would get your vote, and why?
First of all, I would just want to say on Peter Mandelson, this is not to question the Prime Minister's decision to fire him. I think, although Epstein is a different sort of story in the US from the story it was in the UK, when those emails came out, then I'm not surprised that Keir Starmer thought that he should pull Peter Mandelson out. It's worth just saying of Peter, though, that in his time, 9 months as ambassador, he was part of the team that negotiated that trade deal, and he was also the architect of that high-tech deal that was part of the Trump state visit to the UK. So, he had some achievements even in the brief time he was there, and actually I think if he hadn't destroyed his sort of role and his prospects, he might have succeeded, might have achieved quite a lot more there. But anyway, that is not to argue with the Prime Minister's decision that he had to be pulled out. In terms of who the successor should be, look, from what I know, there's a process going on which involved the Foreign Office putting up a short list of candidates from the diplomatic service who they thought were equipped to do the Washington job, and then other names floating around, whether people who proposed themselves or people had the idea that maybe they would be good. And Mark Sedwell is a good friend of mine. His name was out there a few weeks ago, and he told everyone who he knew that he didn't want to do it, including me, so I stopped talking about him in interviews. But Mark is he's now part of the sort of London financial business community. He's working at Rothschilds, and he doesn't want to go abroad again. So he's out of the field, and that leaves you with a Foreign Office list on which one of the names was a man called Christian Turner, who's ambassador to the United Nations, who's a brilliant diplomat at the time of his generation. And another one who's emerged more recently, mostly in the Financial Times, is Nigel Casey, who was David Cameron's foreign policy advisor when I was National Security Advisor, and has been ambassador in South Africa and is now in Moscow, and he is also extremely good and would be a very good candidate if it's him. But on the other side, there is the suggestion, which again is just in the newspapers. I haven't seen Varun, so I haven't asked him if it's true, that since Varun did such a good job as part of the negotiating team on the trade deal, and because he is a businessman, basically, he used to be the CEO of Hacklet, I think, then maybe we should send a businessman to deal with a businessman president. And look, Varun would be very good, though again, how much he'd fancy all those hours and hours talking about the Middle East peace process and that kind of stuff, I'm not sure. But he's a very, very capable and talented guy, and they do a good job. And then you will have candidates we don't even know about yet, and I don't rule out the name of a politician emerging. Yep. I'm not sure about George Osborne, whose name seems to be attached to everything nowadays. Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, chairman of the BBC, who knows?
Bidder for Sheffield Wednesday.
But, there could be a politician out there who comes forward. And it's not unusual. I mean, Peter Mandelson was one of a succession of politicians who've done that job over the last few decades. So, the Prime Minister wants someone whom he can phone up and knows, who can get the phone to him. There's a case for that too.
And unfortunately, I always have a half an eye on the clock, and we're quite short of time. So I'm going to ask you two quick fire questions in one. I mean, just to get your reaction. The first thing is this term kinetic action, which seems to me always a bit of a euphemism for like a war. There's been, where do you see the biggest risk of that happening next year? Obviously there's Taiwan, there's Middle East, there's Venezuela. And the second question is, fast forward 3 years to the end of Trump's second term, what's your sort of headline for what US, European and UK relations look like at that point?
On kinetic action, which, as you say, is a euphemism for people firing missiles and shooting each other and dropping bombs, I'll be very quick point, but I don't think the Ukraine war is going to end anytime soon unless the Ukrainians capitulate and agree to give all that territory, plus to never join NATO and this kind of stuff, which I think Zelensky is impossible to concede and survive politically. So I think that war will drag on through the winter and beyond. And it's potentially very dangerous for us in Europe, because I think if Trump can't get a deal, he may just walk away. He may stop US weapons supplies to Ukraine and ask the Europeans, say to the Europeans, it's your problem. I tried to do a deal. It's your problem, so you do it. And then I'm not sure we have the capacity to actually provide Ukraine with what it needs. I think that the Gaza ceasefire, there's a lot of political momentum, so it will hold, but there's always a risk there, because Hamas is not eliminated, and they can always kick things off by shooting at some Israeli soldiers. But the difficult thing there, we've got the ceasefire, and that can stick, but getting from the ceasefire to reconstruction, to some international force going in, to some international oversight of things, to a new Hamas-free Palestinian leadership, and eventually some sort of political process on a durable solution, is extraordinarily difficult. And if there isn't progress on reconstruction in Gaza over the next 3 years or so, all those people living in tents will get very angry and potentially very radicalized. I think that I don't think China's going to. I hope I'm right on this. I don't think China's going to take military action against Taiwan in the next few years. I think it's too risky, and they're too dependent on an export-led economy. And there's too much importance on getting the Chinese economy to go well. So where do I think the next connecting action is going to be? I think it's going to be an American land strikes on Venezuela, because First of all, they would say, actually I don't think it's true, but there is certainly some drugs coming from Venezuela into America. And Trump, in his inauguration speech, said, the drug barons in Latin America will be designated terrorists, and that enables him, under their view of international law, to strike land targets, to strike drug runners, compounds, and this kind of thing. Much more comes from Colombia than comes from Venezuela, but actually the Americans want regime change in Venezuela as well. And there's now the Gerald Ford, this huge aircraft carrier, and a flotilla of American warships just off Venezuela. There are more ships coming, and I just don't think they're there for a bit of warm weather sunbathing. I think they're there. It's very expensive to keep them there, and I think Trump is quite likely to order, at a moment when he wants to control the narrative and get off something else, strikes on airfields or ports or drug barons' compounds in Venezuela at some point. Yeah. So that's the answer to that question. On where we'll be in 3 years' time, I may be completely wrong on this, but I think the storm clouds are gathering for Donald Trump. I think his personal opinion poll ratings are down below 40% now in most polls, and once you're below 40%, you're in trouble. There was a recent polling that said 76% of Americans think the economy is going in the wrong direction, and that's really serious for him, given that he would say his biggest objective is to boost the American economy. He did badly. Republicans did badly in two important elections recently for Virginia and New Jersey governorships. States they might have expected to win, at least be competitive in. Democrats won both. Midterms next November. If they lose the House, I would put money on them losing the House now, the Republicans, then you can't get any legislation through in the last 2 years of Trump's term without doing a deal with the Democrats. And that really constrains you, really limits you. The other thing that I see is, sorry to bang on, but I think you can see the signs of political mortality in Donald Trump. I mean, first of all, in his first term, he had unearthly levels of energy. He was making 5 speeches a day on the campaign trail, where Hillary Clinton was making 2 a week. He's not like that in the second term. He still is pretty good for a 78-year-old man, 79-year-old man, but he's doing, Washington Post, he's doing 40% less public engagements in the second term than he did in his first term. He is slowing down, he falls asleep in meetings, his voice is a bit weaker, he just doesn't have the energy levels he used to, and it's understandable, and he's not anything like as deteriorated as Joe Biden was in the last 2 years of his term, physically and mentally, but he's not the man he was in his first term. So I think storm clouds are gathering for him. I think the risk is, where things go badly for him, he becomes more capricious and more unpredictable. So the rest of the world, including the UK, is on a tightrope for the next 3 years. But then eventually, he will be gone, and it will be a contest between, I think, the 2 candidates on the Republican side are Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance. Rubio is a much more mainstream right-wing Republican. J.D. Vance, honestly, for me, is an unknown quantity, because he's barely been a politician. He's barely had any time in the Senate. He's become vice president. And he is mentored by a couple of people I'm sure you all know. Peter Thiel is the main one from Silicon Valley. So he's Silicon Valley's guy, and they will give him a lot of money for the 2028 presidential campaign. But does he have the political skills to do it? I don't know. Well, on the Democrat side, lastly, there are a lot of candidates, most of which no one's ever heard of, but actually there will be quite a good bench of people there, quite a good list. And the front runner at the moment is Gavin Newsom, who's governor of California. He's a tall, good-looking man, great hair, absolutely he looks the part, and he is the most prominent Democrat attacking Trump at the moment. And he would regard himself as, I think, front-runner for the candidacy. But there are others around, like Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, J.B. Pritzker, governor of Illinois, and others. So there will be a big Democrat field.
Well, speaking of good-looking men with great hair, we do have to go on to our next panel, I'm afraid. But thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, and please join me in